We would like to welcome everyone today. We do have a couple of programs coming up in the near future. So on Saturday, February the 26th, we are going to have Freeman's Surfman Heroes, where we will have descendants from the P. Allen Life Saving Station be guest speakers here on Saturday, February the 26th at 1 p.m. And then on March the 2nd, we will have our first History for Lunch for the month of March at 12 p.m. And that will be Dr. Smallwood from North Carolina A&T, and he will be talking on the Native American tribes here in northeastern North Carolina. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started today with our History for Lunch. We are delighted to have Mr. Clark Twiddy from Dare County join us today on his book that is available for sale in the museum shop. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Twiddy and let him get started, because I started reading the book last night and I found the stories so interesting in his book about Currituck, or his writing about Mr. Ernie's history living on the Outer Banks in Currituck growing up. So in my understanding, after several people are here at the museum had some stories about Mr. Ernie too. So they were just sharing some of that this morning. So Mr. Twiddy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name's Clark. If I wasn't on camera, I'd come down and just sit right in the middle of this group. Lori, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for reading the book. You're the one. Now I know. So there we have it. And I had a great presentation in line for y'all, but nothing ruins a good story like a bunch of eyewitnesses. Owen Etheridge I see sitting down here. So all my Ernie stories, I'm going to get called on the carpet right now. But the good news is I didn't intend this to be a long thing. So here are my written remarks. They're this short. I won't bore you to tears. I thought I'd walk through just a couple things, and then I would love to entertain any questions that you may have, or I'm happy to share anything about how we came to write this book and share it with you today. I do want to thank the staff at the Museum of the Albemarle, and I want to thank all of you for coming. Broadly, I think the reason that books like this are important, and I don't say this because I wrote it, because books like this are, authors like me are a dime a dozen. We can go out in the street and find one. I am keenly aware that as a region, as we develop, we have an enormous corresponding responsibility to put what we experience today in historical context. And we have folks out there that bring an enormous amount of context to our experience, folks like Ernie, and we'll talk about that. I think it's really important that we share their journey. So that's why we did it. All right. So very quickly, I thought I'd chat a little bit about how we came up with this subject. I thought I would chat about some of the sources that are out there, to include photos. I thought I would share the process and some of the partners that we walked through, some of the timeframes, some of the outcomes, how you make money at this. If you do, why do you even write a book? Do people read it? Some of the good stories that, of course, are out there, and that's probably why you're here. And then any Q&A again. So thank you again. I want to say hello to everybody online as well. Normally I'd come around, but I want to make sure I stick close to this microphone and stay on camera so that the folks who are choosing to attend virtually can be involved as well. Many of you know Mr. Ernie Bowden. Ernie Bowden is 96 years young. The last time I chatted with him, big disappointment. I know there's some folks in here and they came in and said, is this where Mr. Bowden is today? So unfortunately, I'm not Mr. Bowden. I wrote about Mr. Bowden, and we'll talk about that. Ernie is 96 years young. Ernie's father, if I'm not mistaken, was born in the year 1903, the year of the Wright brothers. I do not know of another living individual who can bring that kind of history to the Outer Banks and his mind, and not just the Outer Banks, to our region. We'll talk about that. Ernie can remember his father and the stories his father told about his father, who was born right after the end of the Civil War. So there are few human beings whose minds bridge that kind of history. So you have an enormous story. And as the Outer Banks has grown, as Currituck has grown, as our region has grown, Ernie played an enormous part of it. He would define himself, interestingly enough, as a cattleman first, but he's been everything. He's been an elected official for years. He has been a trader, a livestock trader, a cattleman, a salvage specialist. He has been an inmate of the federal government. We'll talk about that. A proud inmate of the federal government, I might add, and we'll tell that story. And I bet there's a few other ones out here as well. So he's been everything, like a lot of folks were. And at one time, he sat down and did oral interviews with a person in Corolla who's since moved to Chapel Hill. And this person just sat down and had a conversation with him and said, tell me about this and tell me about that. And Ernie recorded them. And then they went and sat on a shelf. And lo and behold, I found them and said, oh my gosh, this is wonderful. What if we took these oral interviews and we kind of broke them up into chapters and we put some context around it? And then I wonder if that might be a good book that helps us preserve our history as a region. So long story short, there was the subject that I thought was relevant, particularly folks like me who work in the development business. I believe we have a responsibility to, again, go back to that context of preserving the past. So there's a subject. I hope that it's relevant. And then we talk about, is there a source? Well, there's the source, Ernie's historical record, Ernie's interview. It's an oral history. And then you also get into photographs. Publishers like photographs. For this kind of history, love photographs. There aren't that many photographs of the Currituck Outer Banks. There's a handful of them. I suspect there are a few collections in people's trunks. I won't name names, but her initials maybe are up in Corova Beach, and I think there are a lot more. But publicly available for research purposes, there's not 100. There may not be 50 in existence that we know about. But you got to have photographs. So folks like Larry Griggs, folks like the Ponton family have some photographs of the place that are able to put in context what the place was. The Washwoods station that's up there, the Coast Guard station in Swan Beach that was 100 years old in 2017, I believe, has a few photographs. So there is the sources and the photographs. And then we talk about the process. And then so we approach a publisher and we say, hey, is anybody interested in writing, maybe reading this book? Would you be interested ultimately in selling it? And the answer, long story short, was yes. And we can talk about that if you'd like to know more about it. But again, I promise I won't bore you to tears. And then you say, okay, well, what's the timeline? So I wrote the book in about a month. And so what I would do is take Ernie's, I kind of broke them into chapters. And then I think about a general audience. I always think about explaining this place to my father-in-law who lives in Dallas, Texas. And we need maps and we need context. So place all of this in context. So I would do a little bit of context, and the words were Ernie's, Mr. Ernie. And so that's how we laid it out. So I essentially did an introduction, some context, Ernie's chapters, and then a closing component to it. Interestingly enough, you'll always think about what to include and what not to include in an oral history. Now, if you know Mr. Bowden, and if he were standing right here, he would say what I'm about to say, and much more bluntly. Ernie has never taken a step backward in his life, and not everything he says is without controversy. For example, the wild horses in Corolla. For example, some other things about development. And I made the decision to not include some of that oral history in that book, because I did not hope that the book would become divisive. I hope that the book would become something that we could all participate in some way. But if Ernie were standing here, Owen, you know what he might actually say about some of those things, because the man's never taken a step backwards and he never will. And he's never been accused, I don't think, of being anything but direct. And perhaps we can chat about that as well. So in about 2 months, you write it, a month or 2 months, I went down, my wife and I have a little hunting cabin, and I would go down there in Hyde County and I would sort through these things on a laptop. I think it was 40,000 words is what the publisher had asked for. So for those of you aspiring writers or who know aspiring writers, 40,000 words was the target. And then they assign you an editor, which was great because the time that it took to spend writing the book with the editor was actually more than it took me to write it. And the editor goes back and forth, making sure that when you say things like he, she, they, them are consistent throughout the book, and that when you're referencing things, it's consistent. They did not propose to modify language or tell you what to say. They just really engage with you about how to say it. Long story short, the book comes out not too long after that. I'm happy to say it was on the Amazon bestseller list. It led the bestseller list for Southern United States history, which made me proud. Not because I wrote it, because again, authors are a dime a dozen. It made me proud that Ernie's story reverberated. And Ernie's story, as you know, is really the story of this region in a lot of ways. So I joke with Ernie about who's going to play him in the movie. Right now, I argue it should be Robert Duvall, but I think he has another, and his daughter has another opinion. I think she wants Brad Pitt. So we'll chat more about that. But it came out, and then ultimately it sold good and it sold well, and I'm proud of that. But again, because of the Ernie Bowden and the Bowden family, because I think it reflected their journey. They are, according to Ernie, the 7th generation of Currituck Outer Bankers, and Ernie's stories back in time that are in this book are amazing. Before we get into outcomes and next steps and then just some good stories, one of the things we think about, or at least I thought about, when you go to write a history book, there's 2 ways to write one. You can write what I call a general history or a popular history. And that means, to me, no footnotes, doesn't have to be totally well researched. When you go read a more classic history, there's lots of research, which is to say, is this book authoritative? And the answer is no, because it's based on one person's memories, and it's not given to us as human beings to be perfect. Although I will say Ernie's memory is outstanding. So I know some folks say that's not right, that didn't happen that way, and I've chatted with some of those folks. But when you go ask Ernie about events, he can rattle off who their parents were, when they got married, the kind of pickup truck they bought. During this storm, they went and did this, and no, that's not true. He's 96 years old. It's hard to argue with because there's not another historical record. So it is not a classic history. It is Ernie's oral memories. So, and on a positive note, I'll say one of the outcomes of this book is when you go places and chat, everybody comes up to you with their Ernie Bowden story. So what should really happen is another book about the stories around Ernie Bowden. There was one gentleman who came up to me and said, my brother died when we were young and he was cremated. And my brother's wishes were to be buried on the sand in Sandbridge. And at the time, for some reason, they couldn't get up through the gate to go spread their ashes. And he called Ernie, and Ernie said, I don't care what the law says, you come with me. And Ernie drove them up there, and the gentleman walked out into the surf and spread his brother's ashes out in the waves. And Ernie stayed a respectful distance, and they got back in the truck, and Ernie drove him back down the beach. And the gentleman said, I'll never forget that, and I will do anything for Ernie because Ernie did anything for me and my family. And it's stories like that that I think, man, just a whole nother book. Anyway, one of the outcomes of this is, the good news is, if you do one book and it actually does okay because people are moderately interested in it, and we have conversations like this, that there are opportunities for other books, which ultimately might be awesome, because if I can do it, guess what? Anybody can. I love encouraging particularly younger readers and younger writers. If I can do it, I promise you anybody can. And maybe it's an opportunity to grow interest in our regional history. We've got an Outer Banks Netflix show right now that, of course, it was not filmed on the Outer Banks. But what an opportunity to grow our history. So we're thinking about maybe a book about bridges and how bridges profoundly impacted the Albemarle area. Or I have another idea for the year 1986 that I think is a year that pivotally changed our region for a lot of ways. So that's one good outcome. And next steps, I think, will be just continuing to chat about it. Ernie is still alive and kicking up in Corova Beach. His daughter drives him around. He still wears cowboy boots and a big belt buckle. His penmanship is actually absolutely beautiful. If you ever see him and get him a chance to sign one of these books, his penmanship alone is remarkable. And he's still out there, but as you might expect, he is not in a big hurry to go move around, and he is not moving as quickly as he once was. So the book is full of good stories. I thought about him. This is a true story from last night. Ernie once said that for those of you who live in rural areas, I bet we all do, I'm going to get this right. The full moon never sees the sun. I'll repeat that. The full moon never sees the sun. So last night, you probably saw a beautiful full moon. So I looked at when the sun rose and when the moon set. And the night before last, I was like, I've got him. I've disproven that. Look, there's the moon and there's the sun. I see it. And I called my dad. My dad said, son, it's not a full moon. It's a full moon tomorrow. And sure enough, the sunset and the moonset, or the sunrise and the moonset, were not the same. So Ernie somehow knows these things. I asked him about climate change. And I said, Ernie, is it just me? Is the world getting hotter? And he said, young man, we're getting closer to the sun, which I thought was an interesting story. And he's full of little anecdotes. One of my favorites is during the Ash Wednesday storm. Really interesting chapter in the book about his memories and deaths in and around Currituck County and what that storm did. Ernie said his father walked down to the ocean and looked at the ocean and the sky and said, we're about to have a terrible storm. And this was before the days of apps and weather channels. Captain Bill, as he calls his father, believed the last officer in charge of the Washwood Station. And we can talk about how they got the Washwood Station and turned it into the Bowden Hunt Club. But he said he described it as a crossbow current. I've never heard of that before, and I grew up on the Outer Banks. I've never heard of that. And that's apparently when the wind is blowing in one direction and there's a current off the beach, but there's also another current coming up the beach. And he said, anytime you see a crossbow current, you're in for it. And I thought that was a really good story. And every now and again, I'll go down to the ocean and look for a crossbow current. And he's full of these little stories. And then one that he probably would love for me to tell. So he's in the salvage business. So Owen probably hires him to go get rid of whales that wash up on the Outer Banks. Because what else do? You got to go do something with them. So Ernie at one time would go chop up these whales and go probably bury them somewhere. So anyway, he's standing on top of a whale one day, and a guy in a pickup truck with a Pennsylvania tag drives by and says, what'd you use to catch that? And Ernie said, my response to him is unprintable, but you can imagine how funny I thought that was. And then there's other instances. Some guy shipwrecked on the beach up in Corova Beach in a sailboat, and Ernie took him in and they lived together for a month. And the guy just would drink tea, and Ernie would come home and he'd be in the house. And then the guy somehow got a ride and said, well, Ernie, thanks, and drove away. And Ernie's never heard or seen from the guy since then. But he said that's just how it was. World War II, he moved minesweepers around. Ernie actually had a terrible burn on his foot that a lot of people don't know about that precluded him from service in World War II. So he was not able to do that. He worked up in Virginia Beach and did a lot of different things. He's been shot before. His dad's been shot before. I mean, he's got all kinds of stories. So with that, let's see how I'm doing on time. 11:15. That's probably just at where you guys wanted to listen to. Is there anything I can chat about? Anything, questions you've got, or any memories you might have? I see some folks in the room who know better than I do. What else can I chat about? Yes, ma'am. Well, I don't know for sure, but my sense is that's when tourism hit it big. That year was the year that Corolla Light, that subdivision in Corolla, was created. And interestingly enough, Corolla Light, Richard Brenly, Dick Brenly bought Corolla Light, the whole thing in Corolla, ocean to sound. I think it was like 230 acres for $3 million. $3 million, 230 acres, ocean to sound. Now there are lots in the Corolla Light subdivision that sell for that amount of money. And that was the year that I think the Outer Banks went from kind of a small town, nice place to be, it went national. And I think a lot of things led to that. A lot of personalities. Ernie Bowden played a key role in developing the Corova Beach, the North Swan Beach, the Currituck Outer Banks. Mark Bassnight was at the height of his power, bridges, transportation, visitors bureaus. You had a pretty interesting public-private partnership in terms of commerce. And I think that to me was a pivotal year in the history of the Outer Banks. And I think we continue to feel that today, whether it's the no hotels, the mini hotels thing, which is ultimately inheriting some of the zoning conversations that went on in many cases 30 years ago. So that's why I think that year was pivotally important. Mark Bassnight, transportation, big tourism, and those kinds of things, particularly on the Outer Banks. Did I answer your question? If I didn't, call me out on it. But that's my pitch, at least to the publisher. And then in bridges, I think, have an enormous part of that. Bridges, as we all know, the ferries, the boat from Elizabeth City to Kitty Hawk, all those kinds of things. Elizabeth City played a key role, as we all know, in the development of the Outer Banks. As a sidebar, the old water cisterns behind Washwoods, the Washwood Station, 100 years old. One day we took those apart to restore them, and they were stamped with the lumber yard in Elizabeth City. So that was pretty interesting. All the lumber, I think, for all those things came out of Elizabeth City on barges and was barged over to the Outer Banks. So I think Elizabeth City and the Outer Banks are inseparable in a lot of ways. I'll tell you a funny story about Elizabeth City at the very end, but it has nothing to do with this. So yes, ma'am. Any other questions I can answer? Anything else you'd like me to chat about? Anything else that, and I might call on some folks in the audience too, because there's a lot of folks here who know better at it than I do. Yes, sir.
What year did Ernie become a county commissioner?
It's a good question. I don't know the exact answer. Owen, do you know? Had to be the 80s. I was gonna say 82.
He was on our term that he was off, and then he came back on in 81. Somewhere along in there when did I tell my state of Ernie?
I would love for you to. That's why we're here, please.
Yep, Harvey Robert from Currituck County. I have a vivid picture in my mind, the first time I ever met Ernie Bowden. Oh, and Etheridge's. Anyway, I'm Harvey Roberts, Currituck County. I'm 69 years old. I'm a farmer. I can remember, I got a clear picture in my mind the first time I ever met Ernie. Owen Etheridge's father brought Ernie around to Shawboro, the farming community, and I guess Moyock too, to introduce Ernie to all the farmers. And I can remember I was behind the big house. I was by the wash house. I remember exactly where I was at. I could see Ernie and everything. So Owen's dad, Doc, brings Ernie up there. Here's a man with a cowboy boots on, the belt, had that bow string thing around his neck and a cowboy hat. And Doc said, Harvey, I'd like to meet Ernie Bowden. He's a cattle farmer over on Currituck. I said, I didn't know anybody had cattle in Currituck or Currituck County. My grandfather and his two brothers were poor boys from Camden County. They moved to Currituck and they were able to buy a lot of property and became pretty big landowners and had a lot of money back then. So one time my father said my grandfather and his two brothers were offered 5 miles of beach property for like 25 cents an acre back in the 30s. And my grandfather went over there and looked and he said, hey, we can't grow cattle, we can't grow corn, soybeans, and wheat. We can't even produce cattle over here. There's no grass for me. What am I going to do with a bunch of sand, you know? So my grandfather and his brothers didn't buy any property. But anyway, so when I saw Ernie, I said, Ernie, I had no idea we had a cowboy here in Currituck County over the Cadillac. I just couldn't believe it. So Ernie impressed me, down to earth man, and of course became a county commissioner, and I tell other stories. But then the other story that really impressed me was, yeah, he was adamant about the fence when Virginia or somebody, the wildlife people, put that fence up or gate up on the beach and wouldn't allow people to go through there. And I can remember reading an article in the paper about Ernie was arrested and put in jail for going through the fence. And I thought, man, that's something. He's really sticking to his guns. He's willing to go to prison for what he believes in. But it was because, you know, he had a family history saying 7 generations have always been able to travel up and down that beach and had the access. So what it all boiled down to, I think the federal government, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, what I remember in the paper, they issued like 15 permits for permanent residents who had lived there long enough to have access to go through that wildlife refuge. And it took a man like Ernie Bowden to stand his ground, willing to go to jail to for his right. You know, 7 generations of right to travel up and down the beach, no compromise. So then all the years Ernie was a county commissioner, he faithfully attended the county commissioner meetings. He had a long ways to travel, but he was faithful to Currituck County. He was an honest man. He would listen. He had common sense. And I just can't say a good enough things about Ernie Bowden. We need more people like that are willing to stand their ground, take a stand, no matter what. And I'm so thankful. I was hoping Ernie would be here today. I hadn't seen him in years and years.
Me too.
But I'll always remember Ernie Bowden and the good he did for Currituck County and standing his ground and a cowboy. So then sometime in the 80s, I was appointed to be on a group of people who did the Currituck plan or something. I got a copy of it at home right now. And I met some people from Kerala. So I met them and they took me up to Ernie's place. And I was impressed and surprised. I didn't know he was taking shipwrecks off and animals and had a construction business. So that was back in the early 80s before when there was a gate where you had to go through the Currituck Outer Banks with a gate.
He writes about that in the book,
Right.
and we had to leave some of that out because the Slick family, and I don't want to talk ill about anybody, the folks who donated the Autobahn, there was some, you gentlemen probably remember that, Not everybody agreed with how that went down. We left that out of the book because there were some 4-letter words in there. I will say very briefly, I'll piggyback on that story. The version Ernie said was he goes to federal prison and the judge says, now, Ernie, I'm going to let you out. But if you drive back down that beach again, I'm going to throw you back in here for longer than that. Ernie said, well, you better not let me out. And he said, Ernie, I trust you. You're an elected official. And Ernie got out and Ernie drove right back down that beach. And Ernie said, that fence is the only place in the United States where you have to go through a fence to access another state. And Ernie said, I completely disagree. So he gets thrown back in prison for longer. And Wilson, it may have been you, somebody in Currituck County was going up to the federal penitentiary and bringing him all the paperwork because he was a county commissioner, maybe the chairman at the time. And he would sign all the paperwork. Yes, ma'am, Miss Barbara.
Wilson came home and said, we're going to Williamsburg. I'm going to Williamsburg. And, oh boy, there's a restaurant I want to eat there. He said, I'm going to prison. I don't think.
Yes, Ernie would sign all the paperwork and conduct the business of government from a federal jail cell. And then they've got sick of Ernie just hanging around in there because he's an elected official. And they're like, look, we're going to let you out. What's it take? And he said, I don't believe in restricting access to public property. And I want the people who grew up there to have a pass. You're exactly right. So to this day, I know Mr. Ponton has one. There are a couple of others that are out there. Yeah. And then they go with the person, not with the family. So that's pretty interesting. And it's funny, Duck had that lawsuit last year, the year before that, about public access to public resources. But think today in this environment about going to prison, willingly to federal prison for something you believe in. I just hard to imagine. And I will also say, I asked Ernie about politics and said, hey, what do you think about politics? And he said, when I was in office, we could disagree and still go talk about it. We would disagree with the issues. But he said, I really worry about the atmosphere that we're in now where we just can't agree on anything. And he said, I'm proud of the way that we conducted ourselves in Currituck County and regionally. He said, we didn't agree on everything. And sometimes we fought like cats and dogs. And every now and again, I thought we were going to fight in the parking lot. But we'd go have our disagreements and then we'd see each other a week later and would say hello and know each other's families and that kind of thing. So I think you're right. Any other questions or any other stories? Yes, ma'am. Miss Barbara. Near the Virginia line and all. He did not. I've never heard that before. Please. Does everybody know Barbara Snowden, Miss History?
Story that I'm running down on about a particular hotel that you could stop at that was up near the line there.
I haven't heard that. The story I have heard, I asked him one time, hey, would you do anything differently? What would you have done differently in Currituck? And he said, we would have developed the Currituck beaches much differently because the density up there, we did at the time because we had no idea it would ever become that popular. So when you look at land use plans, there's actually a lot of property in the Corova Beach, Swan Beach area. And he said, maybe we didn't do that right. But in fairness, we had no idea. And we just couldn't imagine that would ever become what it is today in terms of infrastructure. He dug a lot of the canals up there, some of which maybe were done the right way. And I think if Ernie were here, maybe he did some on Saturdays and Sundays. So a lot of those things. Yes, sir.
What's so amazing up in the Groveland area, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but before they opened up throttle with the gate, I was told there were over 3,000 lots plotted up in Groveland. And they didn't think they would ever be used. And what was that old man, I can't remember his name. McLean? No. There was a man who owned a lot of that property up there, and his son, Chip Freedman.
Chip Freedman, yes, sir. Absolutely.
Chip Freedman.
Gerald Freedman was his father.
3,000 lots up there, more than anywhere else in the county. And they didn't do that in Corolla, but they did it in Kroger. Like I said, Ernie dug a lot of the canals and things up there. So that would probably be something. Nowadays, with everybody wanting to go to the 4-wheel drive area, they wish that hadn't happened, I think.
He would agree with you 100%. And he just said, we just could not conceive of this remote place. Gerald Freedman is Chip's father. He said we could not conceive that the place would be what it is today. And he said we would have probably done some zoning very differently, very different kinds of density and that kind of thing. He talked about the disconnect between the Currituck Outer Banks and the mainland. We talk about that today, but he said, I've got news for you. That existed in my father's day. It will exist in my day, and it will exist for another generation. I asked him about the bridge. I said, when's the bridge going to come through? And he said, well, I went to high school in Oceana High School. And I drove up the beach to Oceana High School, and they were talking about the bridge then. So he said, if I live another 96 years, it might come through. But he said, so that's my position on when the bridge will come through.
Gerald Freeman, they had plans to run the road from Virginia
Yep.
down to North Carolina.
Absolutely.
There was another attorney in Currituck County that was on that field trying to get the road. I can't think of his name right now, but
Ernie said the reason that the federal government stopped that, he said North Carolina legislature and elected officials were all for it. He said Virginia didn't like it. Virginia interpreted putting those roads south as a loud sucking sound out of Virginia's tax revenues.
oh, I know, I can't remember the attorney that comes to me, but Adams, Mr. Adams.
This-
lives in Wellhead.
Absolutely. Mr. Ray Adams.
Gerald Freeman and this attorney were trying to get the road to Corolla.
Absolutely. Mr. Ray Adams owned the Whalehead Club for a period of time. And Ernie said his experience was Virginia did not want to lose that tax revenue, that maybe there was some noise coming out of the Hampton Roads area. We don't want you to put a highway down to drain our tax revenues from our industries and our jobs and put them into North Carolina. And that was his impression of that at the time. Any other questions or comments or stories about Mr. Ernie that we can chat about today? Yes, sir. Mr. Wilson.
The only thing I can say, serving on the board with him, was he would always make you think when he made a suggestion or had something to say on there. And it always, when you had to vote on something, you may not vote in favor of it, but you were thinking about what he said. He'd say enough to make you consider that it could be another reason or some other thing that should be talked about. And, and of course, on that board at that time, we had people on there that zoning was just getting in effect in, and it was interesting to see that, there was some on there that didn't agree with some of the zoning issues at that time. And, he never really said a whole lot about it, best I remember. But, one of the things I was interested in, what he thought about the attempt to incorporate Corolla. And I don't think he was for it. I don't know, at that time, because there was so much controversy at that time. But yeah, I enjoyed serving with him, you know. He had enough, that his age might have had something to do with it, but he had the experience that made you stop and think.
Yeah, his memory, like I several years ago was fortunate to ride around the Outer Banks, the four-wheel drive Outer Banks, and he'll show you the old graveyards that don't exist anymore. And for example, he describes himself as a cattleman from Seagull, Currituck, but Seagull doesn't exist anymore. There is no Seagull, and yet he can very vividly paint a picture of who lived where in this village. The spot in the Currituck Outer Banks where he was born is still visible, but there's no buildings there. He can say, I was born right here. There was a hotel. So, and we think there's no ghost towns on the Outer Banks. There totally are ghost towns. Ernie lived in them and can remember going across ferries and inlets and those kinds of things when he was a young person. He talked a lot about the time of the lowest population on the Outer Banks was right after World War II. All the men had gone and the women had followed them. And he said, there was nobody on the beach. And, you know, post 1945 through that, he said it was very isolated. I don't think Corolla got electricity. I know there's some folks who know. I want to say into the late 60s. And when you think about that, that wasn't that long ago. And he said, so Corolla got dark at night and those kinds of things. So a lot of that development has been very recent. Let me touch on a financial note. So I hope you all go home and find that young aspiring reader in your life, and they're going to say, how can you earn a living? So when you work with a publisher and you ultimately say, well, does this thing generate any money? Because the publisher wants to make money. So the author gets about $3 a book. So if the book I think is $21.99, the author gets $3 of that. So you can do the math and figure out how many books you need to sell to earn a living at it. And I would encourage any young person out there, don't think you can't do it. I'm happy to say in this instance, any money that this book creates, I think rightfully so, will go to the Outer Banks Community Foundation, and we'll set up a fund for the Currituck Outer Banks scholarships for children. The Water's Edge Village School in the Corolla Village Wouldn't that be cool for Ernie's legacy to send the next generation to go get their education and hopefully come back to the Outer Banks? So that's the business of books. I wanted to leave that in case you know of a 8th grader. Only one young person has come to any of my book talks and they fell asleep in the front row. So maybe we'll get some other ones one day. Any other questions I can chat about? Yes, sir. Mr. Etheridge.
Like Wilson, I served with him, I think, 8 or 10 years. Before that, I was on the plant. I used to talk to him about telephone. 2, 3 days a week, he would talk. Never guess what washed up on shore today. Talking about his salvage. Like Wilson said, always prepared. He knew what was on our agenda. He was ready to discuss any aspect of it that came up. And you knew when he said something, he meant it. He was not blowing smoke. He was thoroughly concerned about the impacts of it on Currituck County and the people that he was there to serve. And he looked out for the people. I wrote on Facebook, he was a champion for the Outer Banks of Currituck County and North Carolina, but also not silent. He had a deep affinity.
He really did. I really worry about that when folks like that, none of us are going to live forever. I worry when Ernie passes away, I'm probably going to, what have we lost that is irreplaceable in terms of memory and context and those kinds of things? I agree 100%.
And Buffalo.
And I'd heard, he said beefalo. Apparently he interbred buffalo and cattle and called them beefalo. And he has the last registered cattle herd in Currituck County, and to this day has the brand. He says the brand is registered over at the courthouse, and he has the brand that he branded his cattle with. And he maintains, I'm like, where did all these trees come from? And he's like, well, back in my age, there weren't any trees because the livestock ate everything, kept everything low. That's why the old pictures, it's nothing but sand dunes because the livestock ate everything. And he'll tell stories of, everybody knows kind of roughly where Penny's Hill is. There used to be a little community there. And he said, we'd go trade salt fish, sturgeon roe. He said sturgeon roe was more valuable to us than gold. Sturgeon today, I've had a game warden tell me you're better off with cocaine in a boat than you are a sturgeon. You'll go to jail for less time. Sturgeon, but he said we would go get that and ship them to New York City and we would trade. And he said there'd be weeks and months on end where we wouldn't need money. We would just trade for everything we wanted.
When I raised cattle, I bought a bull and cow.
Yeah, there you go. His mother died, if I'm not mistaken, in the Ash Wednesday storm. Griggs O'Neill's mother died in that storm. I think Griggs O'Neill's mother from exposure. So that was 1963 in Currituck County, people dying of exposure from storms. You think that that's happened a long time ago. That's not that long ago. So interesting that his experience in those big storms and things like that. I would offer anybody in this room, if you have photographs that you think no one's interested, please let those photographs be known. If they're in family chests or up in the attic, reach out to Barbara. Barbara knows everybody about history, the history centers, archives, this museum. Those photographs are enormously important as we try to go back and document our history. And if you have family recollections or anything like that, the best part of this book, the number one reason to write it, is it brings people forward like this today, and it surfaces those perspectives. If that is the only reason to write a book, it's worth doing, because you get to bring these things to light that otherwise may not have actually come to light and been recorded. So I think that's enormously important. And then Barbara, I know you've got a book on old historic structures. There's very few historic structures in the Currituck Outer Banks that have been recorded in any way. So all those photographs, if you've got a photograph of a ramshackle shack on the Currituck Outer Banks, it might be the only one known to exist. And I mean that seriously. So please share that with anybody in that community. Hopefully a younger writer too. All right, I'm at 35 minutes. Yes, ma'am. Oh, perfect. Now, as an old sailor, I've been trained to walk around minefields, not through them. So let's see. I don't believe so. Ernie will get into a debate about the wild horses and the things that came with the wild horses. I do not believe so. Although in fairness, I think Ernie moved a lot of livestock. He would buy it and move it to the Outer Banks and bring it there. The honest answer is I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me, but that's a good question. Ernie, I can put anybody in touch with Ernie. He would answer the phone and be happy to chat with you. His daughter, who is, I want to say I'm not going to guess at her age, but Shirley, thank you. Shirley would be happy to probably set up a meeting, but she protects time and whatnot. But to go get that book signed by Ernie, but he would be happy to answer that question. And matter of fact, I'll follow up on it. I'm sorry, I should have repeated that question. Thank you. Can you say that one more time, please? Did Ernie bring the buffalo to Corova Beach? And my answer was, I don't know. It would not surprise me. Ernie did buy livestock. He talks in the book about going to Rocky Mount and areas like that to buy livestock and sell livestock, and probably up to Virginia as well, but I don't know the honest answer. That's a good question.
Did you mention, I haven't involved with the book yet, did you mention in there that it did have the buffalo and branded things?
Yes, so we do talk a little bit about that. Ernie, I think on his tombstone will say cattleman from Seagull. So he did talk a lot about cattlemen and how he bought and sold things on the Outer Banks.
I forgot that. I was going to mention that too. I mean, this just blew me away. I was about probably 25 years old and a cowboy on the beach.
Yeah, and his brother Tommy was retired from the Coast Guard. Many of you may know Tommy. I believe Shirley said she never saw him in the same room, and they live 3 miles apart. So isn't that an interesting story too? And I've known Tommy and Tommy's family for years. But interesting to see that the different generations and how they interact and whatnot in terms of, it's interesting when you write a book, I tend to think it's about the Bowden family. And sometimes, as with any family, my own included, who do you take guidance from in the family and whose story is told and how do you maneuver through those things in a very respectful way? I hope that if I'm nothing about Mr. Bowden, it's very respectful. So I don't want to get into any of, as a writer, as a chronicler in some way of that. So I walk right around that minefield. Any other questions or comments? I'm at 40 minutes. I don't want to bore anybody to tears, but I don't want to make sure you got your money's worth. I do want to thank the folks who served alongside Ernie, who continue to work for the preservation of those memories. I worry, there's a famous poetry line that says, the big fear is that you lost what you had and you didn't get what you wanted. And I'm paraphrasing. The folks who have served and continue to serve, those are the folks who are working to make sure that doesn't happen. In addition to those of us who just go to work and think every day. But I want to thank the public servants. Clearly, it meant a lot to Ernie. So Owen's comment about his quality of service, I think he was so prepared because he considered it such an honor and such a part of the Bowden family legacy. And he's very proud of that and how he shaped Currituck County. Any other questions, any other comments? Did I leave anything out? We can talk about editing, books, how the cover was made, photographs, time frames, publishers, anything like that. Please go inspire a reader. If you'd like to buy a copy of it, you'd be the one. I always say that as a joke, but please support your local bookseller. Page After Page is right over here. It's also available on Amazon and whatnot. And I've got several copies here. That wonderful lady, Jessica, right there in the back. If you'd like a copy and you don't have one, we'll give you one today. I think Jess, how many do we have? If you want one, we'll give you one. Anything else I can do to chat? My mom told me the key to being a good guest is to leave before it's time to go. So I want to be a good guest too. I'll leave you with my Elizabeth City story. So there's an old safe in Elizabeth City up in the Robinson House. And that safe apparently was the only safe and the only bank in town in Elizabeth City during the Great Depression. And during that time, my question was, well, how did the Outer Banks fare in the region fare in the Great Depression? The answer was, well, it fared great. Well, how did that happen? They said, well, we put all the money in town in this safe. And then we didn't talk about the Depression. And nobody locally knew what was going on. He said people on the Outer Banks didn't find out about things for 6 months. So by the time the Depression had happened and all that, they just didn't know about it. He said, so we fared just well. And on the other side of it, we had all the money in the safe. We fared pretty well and were able to continue to lend and everything like that. So that's an interesting story to me. Like when you think about 1929, Great Depression, Folks on the Outer Banks didn't find out about things for 6 months after they'd happened because that's the flow of information. Now we're lucky if they don't find out in 6 seconds. But at that time, it would take 6 months on the Outer Banks to find out what was going on in New York City. So just think about how much things have changed. And that was Ernie's, early in Ernie's life. I think Ernie was born in 1923. So he was alive when that happened. So we think about it, I do, as ancient history, like some movie. Ernie lived it. So that's my funny Elizabeth City story. Anything else I can do to help with today or be a better guest to the museum? Thank you for the staff. Thank you for all of you for coming. And I'll hang around if there are any other thoughts. Thank our elected officials for their service and their wives and families, because as we all know, the wives and families serve too. Any other questions, comments?
We would like to thank you, Mr. Twiddy, for coming
My
out
pleasure.
today, and thank you for all of our in-person guests and our virtual guests, because without you all, the museum will not be here either. So we thank you for joining us. Mr. Twiddy will be outside the doors. If you would like to have a signed copy of the book, they're available in the museum shop also. But thank you, and we invite you to come back and visit us again. But I think a lot of times when we're telling the history, we like to hear the personal stories. And I know I do. I enjoy the personal stories of history much more because I think we can all relate to personal stories. So thank you for sharing Mr. Ernie's stories with us today.
I look forward to reading your book next. I'll leave you with that.
And just remember too, we try to teach students when they come in here. Today, we like to take pictures with cell phones. And where do those pictures stay at? They stay on our cell phones. So whenever you're talking to a younger person, please encourage them to print the pictures off so that they will have something to look back to. Because a lot of times they might get lost out there in cyberspace somewhere. So please, if you're talking to the younger generation, please encourage them to print these photos off so that they will have something to look for. We're going to have a gap in our society where there are no photos to refer back to. So please, next time you are talking to someone, please encourage them to print those photos off.
And from a financial component, I'll piggyback on that. You can't sell a book without photos. I'll repeat that. You can't sell a book without photos. So you can write beautifully. No one will buy it without photos. So without those photos, there will be no books to sell about our local history. That the two are hand in hand, side by side. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time.